Hi guys, welcome back to Research Unpacked from Informed Performance. My name is Alistair McKenzie and I'm a sports physiotherapist from the UK. In our Research Unpacked episodes, we look to provide you with short and sharp research reviews, as well as the narratives and reasoning behind each publication straight from the authors themselves. On today's episode, we have part 2 with Dr Andras Hegyi. Andras is a post-doctoral researcher from the University of Nantes in France. And in part 1, we discussed his first PhD publication on regional hamstring muscle activity during a Nordic hamstring curl and a stiff leg deadlift using high-density electromyography. Today's episode, Andras expands on his publication with his follow-up study looking at regional activity during a variety of exercises. In this episode, we discuss not only the differences in exercises and how it might influence adaptation and exercise selection, but also the perspectives and complexity around interpreting research in this area, as well as future research ideas. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy today's episode with Andras Hegyi. Andras, thanks for coming back on the show. In part 1, we discussed your first paper using high-density EMG on the hamstrings, using 2 exercises, and I believe this one is just a continuation of that, where you look at multiple exercises. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So we found quite large regional differences in the Nordic hamstring and a little smaller differences in the stiff leg deadlift exercise. So we were really interested to see whether we have regional differences in other exercises that are typically used for hamstrings, and how this affects the intermuscular distribution of the EMG activity.
Yeah, and just to provide some context for the listeners, you separated the exercises into hip dominant and knee dominant biased, with the hip dominant including things like the good morning, the Romanian deadlift or RDL, the 45-degree hip extension, straight knee bridge, an upright hip extension pulley, and a cable pendulum. And then for the knee dominant or more knee dominant biased exercises, you looked at the bent knee bridge, prone leg curl, and a sliding leg curl. Now, all of these exercises depicted and explained within the paper for your listeners, but also key to understand is you looked at a different rep maximum scheme in this paper, being a 12 rep max compared to the 5 rep max for the previous work.
Yeah, exactly. So in the first paper, we had only 2 exercises. One was Nordic hamstring, which was kind of supramaximal exercise in terms of eccentric load. And the other exercise was 5 rep max, concentric 5 rep, which means that the load was not matched. So one aim here in this study was to match the load between exercises. So we did a 12 repetition maximum for each exercise, which is quite low, but we also wanted to minimize fatigue. And we know about the EMG that it's the most reliable if you measure on the same subjects in the same session. So that's the most reliable to compare different exercises in this case. So that's what we did in this exercise, basically, or in this study.
Yeah, and I think in part 1, we discussed a lot about the methodological limitations or key considerations for interpreting EMG data. So I think, should we just jump straight to what you found in this paper and start with, okay, what did you observe with the overall muscle activity comparing across these exercises?
Yeah, so it wasn't a big surprise that we found quite large differences between exercises. So it's quite similar to previous studies, even though not all studies match the relative load between exercises. But even if you do it, you find large differences. For example, it was quite low activation in the good morning or one leg Romanian deadlift, or in the cable pendulum movement. The activation was the lowest. So it means that in the eccentric phase, it was like 20% of the maximal activation that was measured in a maximal isometric contraction. And in the concentric phase, it was like 30%. And what is quite common in these exercises is that the length of the muscle is quite long. At least there is a large hip flexion in the movement. so it's already quite interesting that at long muscle length, the activation is quite low in the hamstrings, because in sprinting, we also have a long muscle length in the late swing phase where injuries happen, but the activation is really high. Of course, we cannot directly compare exercises to sprinting, but it's still an interesting finding, I think. And we also know that when the hips are largely flexed, then the adductor Magnus has a large moment arm, so it has a mechanical advantage over other hip extensors to produce torque. So most likely the adductor Magnus takes over the load from the hamstrings in these exercises, or for most of the range of motion in these exercises. And then for some other hip dominant exercises where the hip range of motion is closer to hip extension, so it's more restricted to the extended hip position, then we have a much higher activation. For example, the highest activation was found in the straight knee bridge and the upright hip extension conic pulley. We also had quite high activation in the knee dominant slide leg curl. So the hip position is quite important, and also it's important or interesting to compare the bent knee bridge to the straight knee bridge, because also when you perform a hip extension, the knee position might be important. So when you have a more flexed position in the knee, then it's not very optimal for the hamstrings. So it's mainly the gluteal muscles which will be activated. And when it's a more extended knee position, like in the straight knee bridge, then you can achieve a high activation in the hamstring muscles. So in terms of overall activation, in the eccentric phase for the activation for the exercises where the highest activation was achieved, like in the eccentric phase, it was like 55%. In the concentric, it went up to 85% of the MVIC. But again, it was just a submaximal load.
Yeah, and generally we would expect muscle activity to increase as intensity or load increases, similar to the higher percentage of muscle activity seen in your previous study with the straight leg deadlift at 80%, 5 rep max, and the Nordic, which is designed to be super maximal, right? But if we're just talking about this generally to inform practice, we can say that during the eccentric phase and at longer muscle lengths, the muscle activity is lowest, like during the good morning and the RDL especially. But obviously this doesn't take into consideration the passive structures of the series elastic movements or the force length curves. And exercises with higher motor unit recruitment generally work in more end range hip extension, with especially with a low knee flexion angle, like the straight knee bridge. So, you know, my bias as a physio being injury specific, I've got some nice information there to inform my practice on exercise selection based on what adaptation or response I'm trying to achieve, either post injury and different phases of rehab or preventatively. So I found that really interesting. And it's really interesting that you touched on the role of the adductor Magnus. And we had James Moore on the main show a while ago, and he talks about the role of the adductor during sprinting and with regards to hamstring strain injury. So definitely direct people to listen to that episode, because he goes into so much detail as always. But if we were to go into the next layer of your study then, mate, and what differences did you find between muscles during these different exercises?
Well, it was quite fascinating that the differences between muscles were quite small. And in the eccentric phase, we found no difference in any exercises. But in the concentric phase, we had higher biceps activation than semitendinosus activation in the 45-degree hip extension. So it's like a hip extension on a Roman chair. And in the prone leg curl exercise, we had higher activation in the semitendinosus than in the biceps femoris. So it's also similar to previous findings. So, but even though the differences are quite small, it's really hard to say if this is meaningful from a practical perspective, because we can see like the intervention study of Matthew Bourne, who had one group with this hip extension on the Roman chair, another group with Nordic hamstring exercise, which is supposed to be semitendinosus dominant. And they indeed found like muscle specific adaptations to the exercises.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with the study, and I think what they found was that both exercises can increase fascicle length, but the 45-degree hip extension may produce greater hypertrophy changes at the biceps femoris, which kind of fits what you're saying with the contraction dynamics of these exercises, with the increased muscle activity during the concentric phase, which we would assume would drive hypertrophy. But I guess what you're saying is, as always, more longitudinal studies are needed to observe this. But I guess, again, from my perspective, and bias as a physio, if I'm thinking about hamstring strains, I know that the location of the strain matters, and from this I can bias my exercise selection to target different responses and biases towards different muscles. So I think it's really interesting. I think the next layer then is what are there any regional differences within these muscles?
Yeah, so importantly, we had quite large differences between regions in some exercises. So we can start probably with the semitendinosus. So it was quite homogeneous for the hip extension exercises. Basically, the only exercise where it wasn't was the bent knee bridge exercise, which is more like combined hip extension, knee flexion. You also have some knee flexion moment there. So it was quite homogeneous there. But in the knee dominant exercises, so prone leg curl, slide leg curl, and also in the bent knee bridge, we had higher activation in the proximal and middle regions than in the distal region. So it was like, for example, for the prone leg curl, it was like 85% in the proximal region, 85% of MVC, and 65 in the distal region. So it's a quite large difference, I think. And it's quite interesting now to interpret these results, because we have some new publications. So there's a new study showing, or there are some studies showing recently, that the semitendinosus is quite important for sprinting. So the relative volume of the semitendinosus is larger in sprinters than in non-sprinters compared to other muscles and other hamstrings. And one study shows that it's especially true for the distal region of the muscle. So one might think that for sprinting, you might want to focus on the distal region of the semitendinosus, which seems to be challenging, but it's definitely not optimal to target the distal region with knee dominant exercises, because we had relatively low activation in those exercises. And for the biceps femoris, we had the largest regional differences in the prone leg curl exercise. And it was quite similar to the Nordic hamstring exercise, and they are also quite similar mechanically. And for most exercises in the eccentric phase, we found lower activation in the proximal region than in the middle or distal regions in the biceps femoris, which is quite interesting, because we have most hamstring injuries also in the proximal region. So it might be a question whether is it because we cannot prepare the hamstrings, the proximal region, to the demands of high-speed running, or is it something that's actually good? Because there is one study showing that the thickness of the muscle in the proximal region relative to the thickness of the aponeurosis, so the ratio between the two, is an actual risk factor. So if you have too large hamstrings in the proximal region or biceps femoris in the proximal region relative to the aponeurosis thickness, that's an actual risk factor. So it might be actually a good thing that we don't really activate the proximal region, and if we don't gain like superior adaptations in the muscle in the proximal region. But it's also important to mention that if you activate the muscle, then you might also gain adaptations in the tendon. So it's just these are the results, but it's really difficult to interpret them without actual intervention studies, especially because the injury mechanism is so complex.
Yeah, and I think you've highlighted some really interesting points and perspectives there that highlight the complexity of this area. And I think, that's why a lot of effort goes into understanding the key contributors to sprint performance as you are now, and the mechanisms of injury and the risk factors, which I think, as we understand in more depth, will give more meaning or clinical meaning to these kinds of studies. But we can say that at these loads, at least, that some of these exercises may not be adequate to stimulate adaptation in the key areas like the distal semitendinosus for performance potentially in the proximal biceps femoris from an injury perspective. But what really interests me there is you talking around the perspectives of what we're trying to achieve, right? And it reminded me of an article by Shermans, or I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and he published an article on the intramuscular coordination between the semitendinosus and the biceps femoris, and found that injured footballers have more of a symmetrical distribution of muscle activity across the two, whereas healthy players had a larger contribution of semitendinosus, describing it as like a trade-off in muscle activation following an injury. But I'd be really interested to understand your or to know your perspectives around this area.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very interesting study, and there are at least two other studies from the same for another group, both published by Simon Avrion. One study showed that at least in submaximal knee flexion, if you have a more homogeneous distribution of activation between muscles, then you fatigue later. So what they found, if you have more imbalance between muscles, which could be like higher semitendinosus activation, then it means that semitendinosus will fatigue quite fast, and then it's not very helpful when you want to prevent injuries. So there are some contradictory studies, and also another study from this group showed that indeed after hamstring injury, the distribution of activation or distribution of torque sharing is what they calculated, is also changes. And what they found is that the contribution of the biceps femoris is lower after the injury. And this is actually compensated by the semimembranosus and not the semitendinosus. But this is also just during a submaximal knee flexion. So it can be like completely different in sprinting because the function of the muscle is different. And between hamstring muscles, we have large differences in terms of architecture. So, for example, the semimembranosus, it has very large pennation angle and short fascicles, but the semitendinosus has very long fascicles, and it's a fusiform muscle. So in sprinting, it may be that the load goes towards semitendinosus because that's what you use more in sprinting. But in a submaximal knee flexion, where basically it's just force production and doesn't need to be at high velocity, then it's more like the semimembranosus that you use. So it's very difficult to generalize these kind of findings to sprinting. That's my point of view, basically, on this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you've given like a mini critical appraisal of that research topic there, which is fantastic. And I think what you highlighted for me is that context is king, and muscle activation or demands during sprinting may be very different and not directly relatable to these submaximal movements that are often seen in research. And I think, again, that really complements like Richard Lieber's work, who, again, James Moore references a lot on the role of muscle function based on architecture. And also to consider velocity as a key determinant that will influence muscle activation.
Yes, but this is just based on the theory, and we don't have a lot of data. So what we try to do now in our lab is to compare the distribution of activation within and between hamstring muscles at different velocities of hip extensions to see if the actual velocity affects which muscle you activate the most. Because it might be reasonable to believe that at high velocities you favor semitendinosus.
Yeah, that's cool. And how far in are you into that project?
We just started the project, so it's
very early doors.
It's ongoing, but yeah, quite early.
Yeah, well, when you've published that one, we'll get you back on the show. But just going back to this paper, and I'm just interested really in the mechanics behind why you might see some of these changes in regional activity. I know you've touched on it briefly with changes in hip and knee angle, but are there any other mechanical determinants that we might influence our practice when looking at exercises and what target areas we're going after?
In terms of regional activation, it's very difficult to say. But some studies show that certain regions may be responsible for certain movements in some muscles, but it's not very well explored in the hamstrings. In terms of overall activation, we know that the hip position has a large effect. So if it's more extended, you will increase hamstring activation. Or the knee position, if it's more extended, then you will increase hamstring activation compared to a more flexed knee position. And what is also important, and it was not discussed in this paper, is that the range of motion might also affect which muscle you activate. So the intermuscular distribution can also change. For example, if it's more, some studies using like dynamometry show that if you do a knee flexion exercise and you are closer to extended knee position, then it favors biceps femoris. And if it's closer to a more like flexed position, then it favors semitendinosus.
Yeah, and I think that comes up in part 3, where we look at your next study, which looks at changes in hip angle during a Nordic and the effect on muscle activity and knee torque, which is another great article. But I guess with regards to more research, what are the kind of areas for future research? What direction for future research? Obviously, intervention studies, and I guess comparing the difference in hamstring muscle activity between injured and non-injured cohorts would be one of the next steps to go, right?
Yeah, definitely. So it's very important to note that these were just non-injured individuals in our study. And in all of the studies we discussed, these were amateur athletes. So we cannot necessarily generalize to other populations, especially after a hamstring injury. We know that the distribution of the activation might change. And also these athletes never had a hamstring injury. So we don't know if certain like activation patterns may predispose to hamstring injury.
Yeah, I'm interested in combining these two articles that you've done involving the stiff leg deadlift, the Nordic, and these other exercise variations, which are all common in strength and conditioning programs, rehab programs. But if we were to think of them progressively to try and construct programs and implement things at different exercises at different times, what are the other considerations that you need to consider around these kind of exercises?
Yeah, well, definitely if you increase the load, then you you will have higher activation. So if we look at the first paper in Nordic hamstring exercise, where we had supramaximal load, we had a higher activation as compared to the prone leg curl in the second study, which is mechanically similar, but it was performed only at 12 repetition maximum. So one driver of adaptations might be the activation of the muscle. But if we think about adaptations, and this may not relate to your question, sorry if it's not, but it's also interesting to mention that like some of the exercises show very low activation, but it doesn't mean that it's not advantageous for hamstring injury prevention. So, for example, if you look at the exercises that are used in the ASK-LINGS L or lengthening protocol, like the diver and glider exercises and the extension. So these are like exercises at long muscle length, but very low activation. They still seem to be efficient in preventing injuries, re-injuries. So it's possible that they work through different mechanisms, but it's not only the magnitude of the activation which may prevent the injury, basically.
No, I think it does contribute to the question. I think it comes down to understanding what adaptation you're trying to achieve, whether you're trying to influence fascicle length, hypertrophy, the contractile or non-contractile tissue, the tendon stiffness. All this stuff comes into play when you're clinically reasoning your exercise prescription. And another plug for the podcast, but we had Alex Wolf on the show a while ago, and he talks a lot about adaptation-led programming. He's a great presenter. So again, I'll push people towards that. But my next question is really, if you were to follow this up with a longitudinal study, what would be next?
Yeah, so a next step from this, now that we see that the distribution is uneven within the muscle, it's heterogeneous, it would be quite interesting to see how this relates to regional hypertrophy, or for example, how the ratio between the muscle thickness and tendon thickness, how it changes with interventions. Also, we are interested in fascicle lengthening, to lengthen the fascicles so that they can absorb more energy in the late swing phase of sprinting. And some studies show that with Nordic hamstring exercise, you can actually increase the length of the fascicles. But it would be interesting to see if it's different between muscle regions. For example, there is a small study, a few weeks long intervention with Nordic hamstring exercise, recently published, which measured fascicle length and sarcomere adaptations in the biceps femoris in response to the Nordic hamstring exercise. And what they found is that the fascicle lengthening, after the intervention, they had longer fascicles in the distal region of the muscle, but not in the middle region of the muscle. So, and also we see the largest activation in the distal region. So it might be that it also affects the regional distribution, also affects these adaptations that seem to be important from an injury perspective. But we have very little data to support this at this point, because it's quite a new research field. But I would definitely step towards intervention studies from here.
Yeah, and that brings us nicely to the end of part 2. And thanks again, Andras, for coming on the show. And in part 3, we're going to discuss Andreas's next paper, which looks at variations of the Nordic and considers knee flexion torque alongside muscle activity. And again, similar to this episode, it has lots of little clinical pearls in there that you can use to inform your practice when it comes to progressive exercise prescription. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you're looking forward to the next part with Andras Hegyi.